Hello and welcome to the Situation Report today. Glad to have you joining me. This is the show where we do our very best to give you the information and perspectives you need to navigate an ever-changing culture. My name is Jeremy Stoliker. Glad to be with you today and looking forward to talking about really a subject that is near and dear to my heart, perhaps yours as well, something that I care deeply about. And something, as we will discuss, that makes me feel somewhat bad. I don't know the right word to express how I feel about this other than to say it makes me feel bad. It causes me great concern for the future of our nation and certainly for my children who are growing up in the environment that we'll discuss here in just a moment. Now, I say all of that to say this is not intended to be a negative conversation, but one that definitely provides the information we need to navigate what's happening around us. There are things happening around us all of the time that need to be addressed, that we need to talk about, that we need to understand, and that we need to keep our finger on, if you will, so that we know what is happening. We live largely, if you're listening to this show, in the United States of America. If you're not listening in the United States, thank you for also listening. We appreciate it wherever you're listening from. But the majority of folks who listen to this show are listening here in the United States. And one of the areas that we have always held on to as Americans is that we were founded as a Christian nation. We've talked about that on this show before. And again, there are a lot of folks who would push back on even that statement. We were not founded as a Christian nation. Our founders may have believed in God, but they were theists or deists. They weren't necessarily Christians. They didn't know perhaps who God was or what it meant. They believed that there was a superpower or some kind of a power outside of themselves, but they don't necessarily or would not have necessarily described themselves as Christians. Historically, factually, we know that is not the case. Now, there certainly were members of those that we would call our founding fathers who were not Christians in the sense that I would frame a Christian. What is a Christian? Someone who believes that they are a sinner, that because of that sin, there is separation between themselves and God, but that God loved us so much, he sent Jesus Christ, his son, to live, then to die in our place, paying the price for our sin so that we could be forgiven. A Christian is one who believes that Jesus, who is God, when he died, 3 days later, rose again, bodily, physically rose again, and that he, in that process, defeated sin and defeated death and makes possible a relationship with God. A Christian is someone who, believing all of that, puts their faith, their hope, their confidence in Jesus for the forgiveness of their sins. That is the definition of a Christian. Now, particularly now, Christianity, the idea of what it is to be a Christian has been so broadened in our culture that just about everything other than a pagan belief falls into the category of Christianity. Even some areas that we once called cults are now identifying themselves as Christians, and a lot of folks who don't know what a Christian is have gone along with that. But when I think about Christianity, I think about those who would hold a biblical worldview, a New Testament understanding of who Jesus is, what Jesus did, and why we would put our faith and our confidence in him. That being said, I know that there are some of our founders who didn't hold to that the way that I do. What I do understand is that our founders believed largely, not all, but the majority believed in the value of Scripture, an understanding of the Creator, describing even in the Declaration of Independence, stating the reason we would separate from Great Britain, stating that we have these inalienable rights given to us by God. Who we are is not something that a government grants or allows. It's something given to us by God. Those are the foundations for our nation. Religious practice and religious liberty has so long been something we have valued here in the United States. The fact that Most Americans at one time have identified as Christians, that it was not uncommon for stores and other businesses to be closed on Sundays so that those in the population could worship. This is something that for so many generations was a part of American life. I don't need to convince you, I'm sure, that much of that has changed. I have two articles in front of me that I want to share with you in part today. One talks about this shift, what the article talks about, what the study talks about, from those who were once religiously affiliated who are now religiously unaffiliated. The second one is a recent article, a study done about the impact of being or claiming to be, in quotes, irreligious, that is, without religion. Something that we talk about a lot, but I don't think we practically understand it well, is that our belief system, whatever that is, has real world consequences in our lives. It's always funny to me when someone will make the statement that what they believe about God and what they believe in the arena of faith, it's very personal to them and should not have an impact on how they treat others or how they act or how they live or how in politics they govern. That is very personal and private. I would argue that what you believe about God and his relationship to you impacts everything else that you do. In fact, Jesus said that when people look at those who are supposed to be Christians, by their fruits they'll be known. How they act, what they do, what they say, what they produce will reflect who they really are. The Bible also explains that from the heart, the mouth speaks. When we see the way someone acts, not in every case, but so often, we have an inside view of who they really are and what they really believe. If I really believe in the sanctity of life, as I say I do as a Christian, that will be the sanctity of all life, not just the lives of the unborn. But I'll treat people well because I believe that people, humans, were created in the image of God. They are the image bearers of God, and because of that, need to be treated well. That should be a reflection of what I believe. If I say I believe that God is and that God has a plan for my life and that God created me and that God created everyone, and yet I am unkind, I am hurtful, I don't value life, then it is fair to ask if I really believe what I say I believe. What we believe will have a very clear connection to how we act, what we do, what we don't do, the decisions that we make, how we govern, how we interact with the people in our lives. You cannot separate the two. When you say you believe something, hopefully that's true, but what you say doesn't always reflect what you believe. What you do most often does, however, reflect what you believe. So, we get to this first study. This is a year old. It is on the Pew Research Center website. The article is titled this: about 3 in 10 U.S. adults are now religiously unaffiliated. 3 in 10 U.S. adults are now religiously unaffiliated. This is a study that was done in 2022, reflecting on 2021. Self-identified Christians make up 63% of U.S. population in 2021, down from 75% a decade ago. So in 10 years, from 63% to 75%. Flip that. From 75% down to 63% in 10 years, this decline. And again, I don't think I'd have to convince anyone that there's been a decline. Let me read some of what this article says. Have you ever picked up a towel set because it felt really soft in the store, but then when you got to use it, it's not very absorbent? It's basically a towel that's leaving you out to dry. That's why MyPillow has developed the MyPillow towels. Towels that work. I know, it's mind-blowing. Towels that actually dry you. Their 6-piece towel set includes 2 bath towels, 2 hand towels, and 2 washcloths. They come in a variety of colors, and right now you can receive a 6-piece set for only $39.98 with promo code SITREP. Go to MyPillow.com right now and click on the radio listener special. MyPillow products all come with a 10-year warranty and their 60-day money-back guarantee. To receive this amazing offer on the 6-piece set of MyPillow towels, just go to MyPillow.com, click on the radio listener special, and enter promo code SITREP or call 800-870-0283. That's MyPillow.com, promo code SITREP. The secularizing shifts evident in American society so far in the 21st century show no signs of slowing. The latest Pew Research Center survey of the religious composition of the United States finds the religiously unaffiliated share of the public is 6 percentage points higher than it was 5 years ago and 10 points higher than a decade ago. Christians continue to make up a majority of the U.S. populace, but their share of the adult population is 12 points lower in 2021 than it was in 2011. In addition, the share of U.S. adults who say they pray on a daily basis has been trending downward, as has the share who say religion is very important in their lives. I'm going to pause there. We'll continue reading this study. But this goes to what I was saying just a moment ago. What you say is far less important than what you do. And as we see these shifts, those who would identify as religious or irreligious, and we see the ratios shift and the percentages change, a lot of that is really a reflection of people being more honest about what they actually believe. It's interesting that people would say they are religious and yet they don't value prayer, they don't value religion, it's not that important in their lives, but they are Christians. So we do have to be very careful about hearing these terms and phrases thrown around. Perhaps some of this is just people being more honest. I'll continue reading from Pew. Currently, about 3 in 10 U.S. adults, 29%, are religious nones. N-O-N-E-S, nuns. People who describe themselves as atheists, agnostics, or nothing in particular when asked about their religious identity. Self-identified Christians of all varieties, including Protestants, Catholics, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and Orthodox Christians. I'll pause again. That's a very broad topic, and not all of us would agree that everyone in that category are indeed Christians, but that's important to understand for the study. He goes on, make up 63% of the adult population. So those Christians make up 63%. Christians now outnumber religious nones by a ratio of a little more than 2-to-1. In 2007, when the center began asking its current question about religious identity, Christians outnumbered nones by almost 5-to-1, 78% versus 16%. The recent declines within Christianity are concentrated among Protestants. Today, 40% of U.S. adults are Protestants, a group that is broadly defined to include non-denominational Christians and people who describe themselves as just Christian, along with Baptists, Methodists, Lutherans, Presbyterians, and members of many other denominational families. The Protestant share of the population is down 4 percentage points over the last 5 years and has dropped 10 points in 10 years. By comparison, the Catholic share of the population, which had ticked downward between 2007 and 2014, has held relatively steady in recent years. As of 2021, 21% of U.S. adults describe themselves as Catholic, identical to the Catholic share of the population in 2014. Within Protestantism, evangelicals continue to outnumber those who are not evangelical. Currently, 60% of Protestants say yes when asked whether they think of themselves as born again or evangelical Christian, while 40% say no or decline to answer the question. This pattern exists among both white and black Protestants. Among white Protestants, 58% now say yes when asked whether they think of themselves as born again or evangelical Christians, compared with 42% who say no. Among black Protestants, evangelicals outnumber non-evangelicals by 2-to-1, 66 versus 33%. This article goes on to explain the downward shift and the downward trend in so many areas. You break down any area related to religion, religious belief, religious practice, the United States, every single area is in decline. From being religious, identifying as Christian, to not so much. A lot of people who aren't sure may call themselves agnostic, so not Christian, but certainly not atheist, not having fully rejected the idea or the notion of God. But where we once stood as a nation, where we once held to these, what we call Judeo-Christian principles, these principles found in the Christian faith, found from Scripture, these principles that we all generally agreed upon, those no longer are guiding our public discussion. Culture is changing, and one of the areas that culture is changing very, very quickly is in a belief in the absolute God, in the absolutes that govern our lives, in a Bible that is historically true and relevant for us today, the basic tenets of Christian faith that helped to found our nation and have continued historically to carry us forward, to help us to understand what the family is and how the family should operate, what charity is, both locally and abroad, how we should function within a community and a society and with each other, how we should behave, what we should allow and what we should not allow. I think currently we can see the great shift in religious identification and belief, even in the discussions that we're having around the world and in our country regarding gender. Where does an identity of gender come from? If we weren't created, then it doesn't matter. We can self-determine. We have these conversations and we wonder, where has it come from? And yet we see the lines of increase in conversations about topics we once would have stayed away from, directly connecting to a decrease in a belief in the absolutes of religion and Christianity. I say all of that to get me to another article. From the Stream, we find this article. The title is Increased Suicides Among Middle-Aged Americans, potentially, that's an important word, linked to decreased religiosity, study finds. This is an article from January this month, just a couple of days ago. Fascinating. Let me begin just by reading it, and then we'll draw some conclusions. This is written by Kate Anderson, again on the Stream. A recent working paper published by several university professors found a potential link between declining religiosity and suicide trends in the 90s. Now, remember, we hear these dates. All of these studies have to go back several years in order to have the data necessary to draw conclusions. What would be done then with a study like this is that data would be extrapolated and we could predict how things will continue, all things being the same or getting worse or getting better. The study, titled Opiates of the Masses, in quotes with a question mark, Deaths of Despair and the Decline of American Religion, focused on the uptick in suicides during the 90s and pointed out a possible correlation between the rising in deaths of despair and a marked decline in religiosity. The paper was published earlier this month and noted that the trend seemed to be most apparent in white, middle-aged males. We're going to work through this together, but keep in mind that what this illustrates is what you believe has a real consequence on how you behave. The article continues. The religious decline in question involved measures called blue laws that regulated commerce at certain times of the week, often Sunday mornings, but were removed during the 80s and early 90s, according to the paper. We find that for middle-aged Americans, the repeal of blue laws had a 5 to 10 percentage point impact on weekly attendance of religious services and increased the rate of deaths of despair by 2 deaths per 100,000 people, the study stated. Applying these results to the decline in religion at the end of the century suggests that this decline could be responsible for a reasonably large share of the initial rise in deaths of despair. Professors Tyler Giles of Wellesley College, Daniel Hungerman of the University of Notre Dame, and Tamar Ustrom of The Ohio State University co-authored the paper. Much of the previous research on the increasing amount of suicides and substance abuse-related deaths in the U.S. looked at data from 1999 and beyond. But the professors decided to look back further and noticed religious attendance had also significantly dropped off during this period. Quote, starting in the late 1980s, many measures of religious adherence in the U.S. began a sharp downturn. This decline has been noted by researchers studying religion, but its proximity to the initial rise of deaths of despair has largely gone unnoticed, end quote, the researchers noted. Quote, second, religiosity is well known to be strongly correlated with health outcomes. Third, this religious decline was extremely large and widespread, so that it may have had quantifiable effects on mortality rates, end quote. Prior researchers have pointed to the opioid crisis as the main reason behind the startling climb in suicide numbers, according to a 2015 study by Princeton University researchers Ann Case and Angus Deaton. While Case and Deaton concurred with Giles, Hungerman and Ostrom that white Americans aged 45 to 54 were the ones most affected by the suicide epidemic of the 90s. Their research attributed the increase on the erroneous prescription of drugs like oxytocin and declines in mental health. The epidemic of pain, which the opioids were designed to treat, is real enough, although the data here cannot establish whether the increase in opioid use or the increase in pain came first. The 2015 study explained, pain is also a risk factor for suicide. Increased alcohol abuse and suicides are likely symptoms of the same underlying epidemic and have increased alongside it, both temporally and spatially. Giles, Hungerman, and Ostrom, however, noted that the previous research, as well as many others, admitted that their findings were incomplete, according to the study. They argued that the research often focuses on 1996 and beyond, subsequently ignoring crucial data from the earlier 1990s and even the 1980s. Our descriptive work focusing on a break from trend in the early 90s makes this clear. OxyContin was first introduced as a prescription drug in 1996, yet already by that year, deaths of despair for middle-aged white Americans were well above trend, with over 15% more deaths than one would forecast using data from the 1980s, the paper stated. The large negative outcomes that we observed for the United States in the 1990s highlight that religiosity can play an important role in well-being in a highly developed society, even absent large-scale wars and natural disasters. The researchers pointed out that data had shown states with large declines in religiosity also saw a sharp increase in suicides and substance abuse-related deaths, while states that maintained or increased religious adherence did not see such spikes in self-harm, according to the study. In conclusion, the paper emphasized the need for more research regarding the cultural and religious influence on the mental and physical health of Americans. Using shocks based on the repeal of blue laws, we then demonstrate that negative shocks to religious practice had relatively large impacts on deaths from poisoning, suicides, and liver cirrhosis for middle-aged Americans in the late 20th century, the researchers said. These results underscore the importance of cultural institutions such as religious establishments in promoting well-being. Man, what a great article. This was on the stream. Originally, it was found on the Daily Caller News Foundation, written by Kate Anderson. Great article. And I mean, there's so much here. It's relatively short, but connected to what we understand about the religious decline in the United States, I think we can draw some real conclusions. It is interesting to me as I read this article and look at the data that was used, that the initial conclusion had nothing to do with the decline in, again, what is called here religiosity or religious belief or faith in God or Christianity, or even laws that governed behavior on Sundays and at other times that religious practice would happen. But that the initial conclusion was drugs had the biggest impact on suicide deaths. Now, certainly, and we see this even now, they're looking at data from the 90s. We see this now. The opioid epidemic we talk about often, the number one killer of a large demographic of folks who die in the United States every year. This is terrible, of course. But if we look to the wrong place and try to fix the wrong symptom, we're never going to address the actual issue. We have to think clearly and understand clearly if we're going to make good decisions, particularly even for legislatures and others who are making decisions and writing laws and voting on laws that would govern some of our behavior and access to substances. Is it the drugs that are causing the lack of religious belief and religious practice that are leading then to suicide deaths? Or is it the decline in religious belief, the increase in those who would identify as having no religious preference, the rejection of an absolute God and an absolute Bible that applies to our lives absolutely, the increased belief or acceptance of a philosophy, a theory that says we came from nothing, we are nothing, we're going to nothing? Is it that created then the desire among people, or the response among people who have rejected everything else, rejected anything outside of themselves or their situation, that caused them to look to substance to mask or deaden the pain that they feel, the hopelessness that is connected to really nothing, that then leads to the actions of, in many cases, self-harm, suicide, overdoses, drug deaths, an increase in substance abuse? Which is driving the other, is the question. I think this article makes a strong case that it is the lack of religiosity, the lack of faith, the lack of belief in God or Christian practice that leads to seeking answers outside of faith. And those answers so often bring people to an even greater level of despair and hopelessness. I talk about this today, and again, this is very important to me personally, certainly as a Christian, someone who believes that we have a responsibility to share truth with others. This is very important because it illustrates that faith and religious practice, and I use that very, very broadly. I struggle to use it as broadly as I do. I believe that religion and even faith can be very empty if it is not about having a relationship with God through Christ. But the data would support that even simply believing in God and believing that God exists and that God created and that God has a plan for my life, even if I don't understand who Jesus is or why it's important to have a relationship with him, just having an understanding that there is a God outside of my situation, a God that's bigger than me, bigger than my circumstance, bigger than what's happening in the world, that gives hope. And that in religious practice is found hope and found direction and found peace and chaos. And that then negates the need, in many cases, to, quote, self-medicate. This is important because as we continue to see a decline in faith and a decline in religious belief in the United States, we cannot watch that decline and accept what we are being told about religion, specifically that it is entirely personal and has no impact on the way that anyone lives. The conclusion I draw from these two articles, both based on research, statistics, data, is that if we as Christians don't do a better job of communicating to others why it is that they need to believe in God and practice faith and religion, if we allow this continued slide away from the absolutes of God and Scripture, if we relegate religious belief and religious practice to something so personal that it has no impact on anyone around me, on the way I behave, on the things I do and say and think, if we allow that to take place, we have to do so realizing, understanding that there will be deep personal, family, cultural, societal implications. You cannot reject God and go on with your life as normal. Find hope and direction, joy in living. You cannot divorce the absolutes of a creator from your personal philosophy, ideology, and manner of life, and not eventually run into the emptiness, the abyss of having no created purpose. I do believe that there are people who practice religion in a manipulative, overbearing, harmful, hurtful way. I'm not talking about that. What I'm specifically speaking of is that as we decline culturally in our understanding of God, we will increase culturally in actions and activities driven by hopelessness and despair. And to this, we must be warned and do everything we can to prevent that slow, gradual decline. I'll conclude with this. As I think about this, I then have to step back and ask the question, well, what can I do about it? That's a good question to ask. Perhaps we can drive policy, elect officials who will make good policy. Maybe we can do that. But specifically what we can do, I think, at least for me, falls into two specific actions. One, I can be consistent in my practice of faith. My manner of life can reflect what I do believe about God and Jesus and the Bible. Because as I live a life that reflects what I truly believe about who God is and how He has created me and everything in the world, and that He has created me with purpose and direction, that Christ died in my place to pay the price for my sin, and in that I can have freedom. That I have a home not only on this earth, but eternally because of that spiritual freedom. When I live out my life in a way that reflects that belief, a hopeless world around me must take note. They don't have to accept it, but they have to see, they must see that there's something different. That's number one. I need to live consistent with what I believe. Number two, I need to teach my kids to do the same. I don't have the statistic in front of me, but we know that something like 70% of young people who get to the age, having grown up in a Christian home, a home that puts a value on going to church, something like 70% of those kids, when they get to the age where they can make their own decisions, will walk away from church. Now, many will come back later on in their lives, but in their late teens and early 20s, many, many young people who grow up in Christian homes will walk away from the faith. Why is that? A lot of reasons. One of the big reasons is because parents are inconsistent in their own faith walk, and because they don't teach their children how to live. This, to me, the article from Pew Research is frightening, somewhat discouraging. Reading the article that I just read to you, increased suicides among middle-aged Americans linked to decreased religiosity, that frightens me. But it also stirs in me a desire to do something about it. And what can I do? Live consistent, teach consistent, encourage those who are doing right, and encourage you to do the same. I hope that's helped you today. Again, that was not intended to be negative at all, but something we need to understand and realize that your faith practice, it is personal. It's personal, but it's not personal in that it doesn't affect the way you live or the things you say or the things you do. It should impact everything because it's what you believe. Take heart, take hope, be encouraged, and let's do our best to encourage a generation that's coming up behind us and looking for answers. If you have the answers, because they're found in God's word to us, then share those. and encourage others along the way. I do appreciate you listening. Again, if you have not yet subscribed to the podcast, please do that. Do it right now. You can subscribe. That would be fantastic. Share this podcast out then with others. You share the content out with others. That'd be fantastic. Also, go to YouTube. You can find our channel. Go to YouTube, then search for The Situation Report. You'll find us there, and that would be fantastic as well. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, leave us a comment, share that content out with others, and that would be fantastic. Thank you so much for watching and or listening. I look forward to talking to you next time.